Well, one of the first guys I met was this guy who wouldn't let me use his name. And it was like, it was one of those infuriating things. Every time you go out on a murder, there's one guy who will talk your ear off and has authority and everything. And then it's like, oh yeah, but you can't use my name. And it's like, oh, what do I do here? So I just called him in the article a man close to the case, because I had the conversation with him about that. We haggled over it. We said, I go, oh, can't I call you? He goes, no, a man close to the case. And so anyway, so he was really good at kind of framing the whole story for me. He just kept on talking these like great sound bites, and he's not like a writer. It was like so he started talking about it. He goes, oh, this case never got traction like the Azaria Chamberlain thing, because there, you know, all these other Northern Territory cases, because there was no crocodiles. God, if there were crocodiles, this story would have made it. Because he was really interested in this case and all the dynamics in it, and he was like, how come this case is pretty much unknown outside their own community?
What is it particularly about crime that you find so compelling as a subject matter?
It gives you something to do, like practical. You go, okay, I have to go here and try to find out what this person thinks or what happened, and it's a real practical thing. But then whilst you're going on this kind of journey, you kind of like soak up all this other stuff that I'm actually probably more interested in than the murder. So in the case of this, going to Katherine in the Northern Territory, was like this 3-hour drive from Darwin, this little community. It's like I soak up things about, you know, racism and about the little different communities, you know, the different socio-economic communities within it, and you sort of get to talk about that, but not in this. You don't have to like do it in a literal way. You do it by, hey, you talk to this guy who's involved in the murder, and he happens to be really wealthy, and then you kind of learn that, oh wow, in this like little community that you just expect to be all full of poverty, there's actually there is a kind of a community within the community that's really wealthy, and then just all the complications about how different communities, different tribes kind of get on or don't get on. And I guess that's what I find interesting. And yeah, and you just get to talk to people, because if you kind of just go up to people and go, oh yeah, what do you think about racism? What do you think about poverty? Like it just kind of goes nowhere. But if you kind of talk to people and say about the murder, it's like, well, you know, did your son do it or whatever? Suddenly you hear, well, yeah, I tell you why they got him. It's because he's Indigenous. And let me tell you, Ray, he would have been in jail earlier if he was a black man, not a white man, because he'd beat up on his wife, but he never got thrown into jail because he's a white guy. And so suddenly you get the story of race and of tribes and all that, but, you know, in a more kind of active, demonstrative way.
Tell me about the strange legal limerick that you stumbled across.
I was in this bar, and I was actually quite annoyed. I'd bumped into these two lawyers, one of who I'd known from Melbourne years ago, and they started like pulling, like lawyers, just started pulling the rug out of everything I said, like saying, well, that's not true. Like in other states, there's mandatory sentencing of this, and then like they were saying stuff that sort of like in a very, subsequently I realised in a very kind of if you omit a lot of things, it's kind of true. But basically their whole thing was, everything you've discovered so far over your 10 days is wrong. And I was like, what? And anyway, and they said, oh, listen, you've got to talk to this guy called Russell Goldflam from the Criminal Lawyers Association of the Northern Territory, because he said a lot about mandatory sentencing. And they told me he was like strange or something, which I didn't know what it meant. But then, so then later on, yeah, I rang him up and I just said, oh, I'm writing about the Zach Grieve case. And he said, oh, Zach Grieve. And he's like shuffling through papers, I just hear it. And then he goes, I wrote a limerick about that case. And then I said, oh, I'd very much like to hear it. And then over the phone, he read out the limerick, which was, understandably, Grieve is aggrieved by the sentencing, not disbelieved. Wasn't there, he got more than his mate. That's the law. As for justice, that's hardly achieved. And I thought, it's pretty lucky I got a true crime limerick.